Oceans have always terrified me, just the feeling of open water, not knowing how far below you something could be lurking in the depths, waiting to devour me with no rhyme or reason as to why, just the primal urge to feed. Figured getting away from Earth would solve that fear, especially considering Mars was mostly desert as far as the eyes could see. Bet you didn't know there's a whole terraforming colony up there already, did you? Yup. Ever since the 90s when we sent the first small crew up, the world's governments have been steadily supplying scientists, builders and equipment to Outpost Genesis. Work has been slow going, but we've seen a hell of a lot of progress over the couple of decades we've been up there. Hell, I've been doing 3-year-on, 2-month-off stints for the past 20 years, slowly helping to build up a survivable planet for my fellow humans. Honestly though, I love it here. Things are different, sure, and I'm not entirely used to missing some Earth commodities after all these years. But knowing we're up here for a real good reason is enough for me to look past all that. We've known for years now that the Earth wasn't going to be sustainable for life as we know it now, either due to climate issues or overpopulation eventually making things go batshit insane. Hell, up here, we even have a running bet on exactly what's going to cause Earth to blink out of existence first, and most of us are pretty sure it's going to be human hubris and violence. As cruel as the Earth could be to us, humanity was always finding ways to be even more cruel to each other. Up here, though, I didn't have to worry about that. Meals were taken care of. I had friends to go out drinking with after we got done with the tasks of the day, and things were honestly pretty comfortable. Maybe 400 of us lived up here in total, everyone with their own job and duty to the outpost. I do geographic surveys, picking out the best spots on the planet for new outposts, resource stations, things like that. The best part is, it pays well and I haven't had to spend a damn cent while I'm up here, so the account back home is bursting whenever I decide to retire. The sun came up and signaled a start to the day, waking me from a delightful dream to an awful, awful hangover. My head was pounding like someone was taking a jackhammer to the base of my skull, and the last thing I want to do is take a research buggy out with 2 other surveyors. Work is work though, and there's no calling out for hangovers up here, unless you really, really want to get in trouble. So, against my will, for the most part, I met up with Sandra and Sho in the transport bay to get on the metaphorical road. "You look like shit," Sho said, laughing at me as I walked into the locker room. He was already halfway into his pressure suit, making sure everything was locked in and secure before we entered the atmosphere of Mars. "What time did you end up tapping out?" "Probably around 1. You?" I asked, finding my way to the nearby sink so I could cold water on my face. It hit like a brick wall, waking me up much more. "I was out of there by 11, had my drinks, did my rounds, and my ass was in bed before midnight," he retorted. "Is Teller here yet?" Sandra said, busting into the locker room already suited up, a huge pack of supplies in her arms. Through the door into the transport garage, I could see our home for the day, one of the mobile survey labs that were scattered throughout the outpost. It was like a small RV, set up with seals, ventilation, and everything needed to do our jobs out in the harsh desert of the Red Planet. "Morning," was about all I could mumble back to her, dragging myself over to the locker containing my Atmos suit. I hated these things, even after all the years I've been using them, and it was like being put into a little cage. I went diving once in my life and it felt like the same thing, knowing that only the helmet you're wearing is keeping you from a terrible fate of suffocation, whether it be under the seas or in the hot sands right outside. "Told you. Should have gone to bed earlier last night instead of hitting that last Jack and Coke." Sandra was laughing now as well, turning back with her bag of supplies to load up the research vehicle. All I could do was grumble my discontent as I crawled into the Atmos suit, hearing the pressurized hiss as the last seal snapped into place. Sho walked out to the vehicle before I could leave the room, telling me I had 5 minutes to finish sobering up. "What, they gonna give me a Martian DUI?" I shot back, grumpier now. Not sure why I was so irritable today, but something just felt more off than usual. It took a few minutes, but we all finally loaded into the survey RV, making our way west toward the newest survey site. We had a lot of luck in the past few weeks discovering areas that could possibly support life, with the right push of course, and things were looking pretty bright for the first time in years up here. Maybe that's why I felt so off, the feeling that something could go wrong when everything was going so inexplicably right lately. The drive was a nightmare though. Know how the infrastructure on Mars is set up? It's not. Any expedition we took was traversing rough, red sand and rocky terrain. with the huge wheels on the RV barely able to handle some of the more jagged chunks of rock that would spike up from nowhere under the sands. I swear the wheels on this thing would tear up a whole mountain back home. But here, every little rock they ran over felt like someone stabbing a dagger into the back of my head. Maybe 3 hours later, we finally reached our destination. I might have ended up asleep if I wasn't the one driving, but Sho and Sandra decided to do their pre-survey checks on our way there, so I was left with the short stick. When we arrived, I could see why we were being sent to study this place. In the midst of the red sands that were stretching around for miles, this single formation of rock stood waiting. It wasn't quite big enough to be a mountain, but as tall as a 5-story building maybe. It went up high enough that we would probably need the entire day just to climb up. "Seriously, we have to get up there," I said, letting out an even bigger groan than when we took off. "Nope, under it," Sho answered, heading past me out of the doors. I could see on closer inspection that there was a small opening at the base of the structure. A cave, entrance wide enough for a small truck to pass through, was there, gaping open as if inviting us into the darkness beyond. "Grab some flares and floodlights. We're going to take the buggy as far as we can." I pressed a button, loosing the small transport buggy we held in a small bay at the back of the survey RV. It rumbled out with a small hiss, the open cabin and bed in the back already piled with what we would need. Just in case, though, we grabbed a few more of the flares and high-powered lamps. If it was dark, we were going to at least be prepared. Even with all the light we were holding in reserve, it took a moment to gather courage once we reached the cave mouth. Everything beyond was pitch black, a complete absence of any kind of light source. We turned on the brights on the buggy, and those were barely able to penetrate past the first few meters. All we could tell was that the ground sloped downward hard almost immediately, meaning we had a descent in store. "Ready, boys?" Sandra asked, looking to Sho and I both before pulling one of the flares from a bag. Might be making a discovery that will change humanity's future after all. "Been hearing that for years," Sho mentioned. Sandra chuckled, handing each of us flares to keep in our belt. We set off, brights cutting through the darkness maybe 20 meters ahead, with the abyss running endlessly ahead of us. The rumbling of our wheels echoed off high walls, crunching over hard rock beneath us. As we got further in, the rocky sand of Mars's surface gave way to solid red stone. I found myself tapping the brakes more frequently as we went further down, the descent becoming steeper exponentially. "Hey, think we're going to have to go on foot from here. Drop-off is getting too dangerous for the buggy," I said, slowing down enough to pull the emergency and set it in park. Never thought I would need a parking brake on Mars. We set off on foot, loading up flashlights and flares, along with a few small light markers to find our way back more easily. Not like the path was very non-linear, but when you're underground it's easy to get disoriented. Our boots echoed loudly as we walked across the smooth red rock, shining like a beautiful granite below us. It was so much more brilliant than the dull rock on the surface, almost mesmerizing in the swirling patterns set deep into the stone. Drip, drip, drip. All three of us stopped at the same time, the sound setting off billions of alarms in our minds that all pointed to that life-changing discovery: water on fucking Mars. We all looked at each other, not even daring to believe we were the ones to find something like this. We've been theorizing about this for decades, maybe centuries, but to be the ones that actually find it, we would be fucking gods back on Earth. "No way," Sandra whispered. "We're gonna be loaded." Sho was giggling already. "Don't get your hopes up just yet. Our luck it's fucking oil or something," I mentioned. "Oh, so you Americans will be up here in no time." Sho laughed louder. We all kept moving forward, scanning the walls with bright flashlights, hoping to find the source of the drip. It took minutes of walking, the drip echoing louder through every step we took. "Hey, it's in our constitution we're allowed," I retorted. "Life, liberty, and the pursuit of that sweet, sweet oil money." Sandra chuckled as we walked on, still scanning when we noticed a faint glow coming from further down, bright blue tinted red against the stone encasing us. We didn't stop, but I know I held my breath for the next few meters before we entered the huge open cavern. Above us, a cavern of stars was spread out for miles, phosphorescent blue shining down from something on the stone roof. As we watched, the occasional drop would fall from them, landing atop the sprawling ocean split in front of us. The light reflected a deep red on the liquid surface below. A solid, shining pathway of rock divided the sea in front of us, glowing bright with the same bioluminescence. I pulled out a test tube from one of my belt compartments, moving to the edge of the liquid substance to take a sample. "Don't just stick your hand in," Sandra shouted. "I'm not an idiot," I mentioned, removing a small pair of tongs from another pocket. Gripping the tube tight enough to keep hold but loose enough not to shatter it, I made sure to go slow, dipping it down into the strange, subterranean ocean. It took more force than I expected, the substance being much more viscous than expected. When I pulled the tube back up, it was dripping from the outside, slowly joining the echo of whatever was falling from the ceiling. I capped it, shaking it off before bagging and wrapping it to protect the sample. After it was safely sealed up, I shined my flashlight on it to get a clearer look. It was a deep crimson, thick, and it looked like something was swirling around in it. Possible organisms in it. God, getting this under a microscope. We found something big, y'all. "Should we go ahead further?" Sho asked, walking to where the small pathway narrowed in, leading deep through the ocean cavern, a split in the Red Sea. He was shining his flashlight down the way, trying to see into the deep black, punctuated by blue, glowing stars. There was no end in sight to the cavern, and the ceiling was so high the light's beam wouldn't even reach it, leaving the glowing stars above to their own devices. "Not yet. I want to come down here more prepared first," Sandra said, standing to put away a sample of the phosphorescent material. "Looks like a type of spore, but we need to have more light. Some flotation devices for safety. Getting this back to the folks at base is going to be huge." "All right, so what? Mark it and head back to the rig? Or should we hit the gas back to base ASAP?" I asked, stepping away from the edge. There was something about it that was making me feel odd. The discovery was something to be proud of, and I was happy about it, but there was this nagging sense, that feeling that I shouldn't be here, that nobody should be here, ever. "Actually, I vote for hitting the base as fast as we can. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting the creeps." "Same here," Sho replied. We packed it in, turning to leave. We were so focused on the sea in front of us that we didn't even think to look back at where the entrance. Now noticing the walls around the small cavern opening, dozens of etchings were in the cavern wall, stitched together in a bizarre series of shapes and drawings, making no comprehensible pattern from our perspective. Sho walked over, putting a hand up to one of the deeply carved lines in front of him. The smooth bores in the wall were finely crafted, put in with utmost care. "So that doesn't happen naturally," I stammered out, approaching another section of the wall. Everything was immaculate. Compared to the rough, rocky surface above us, this was smooth, carved with passion by hands in reverence, or perhaps fear. That chill ran up my spine again as I stepped back, looking up to where the bizarre glyphs extended high to the cavern ceiling. There was no visible end, even with our high-powered lights. No telling what they became further up. "All right, that's enough for today. Let's head back." Wow. The ascent back up was taxing, the incline much more steep than it seemed on the way down. The thought kept coming into my head that there was something back there, waiting for us to turn our backs on it so it could sneak closer, getting the jump on us. Every time I looked back, though, the empty cave greeted my eyes, with nothing to show beyond a blanket of darkness. By the time we made it back to the buggy, we were all completely exhausted, panting hard in the stale air of our suits. We loaded in, hitting the reverse and relying on autopilot to get us out of there and back to the surface in about 30 minutes, with only minor bumps and scrapes from the narrow sections of the tunnel. The glaring light of the surface was intense, sun baking down to give us a reminder of how hot the surface was than down below. The RV was there, covered in red dust as if it had been through a sandstorm. It took us a moment, but once everything was loaded in, we set off back to the base, samples in hand and eager to look closer once we returned. "Garage, we're coming in," I radioed once we began to get close. "Research vehicle returning. We've got some big news." "Teller, that you? Are Sho and Sandra there too? Where the fuck have you been?" Comms responded, almost screaming into the mic. "We've been out at that research spot. You literally let us out this morning," I replied, confused. "You've been gone for 2 days. The hell did you do out there?" Comms asked back, confusion taking over the anger and fear in their voice. "Did something happen? Did you break down?" We got back into the garage within minutes, deciding to check in and debrief there rather than explain over comm systems. 2 higher-ups came in to meet with us, shuffling us into a small lab nearby. They didn't enter, though, instead standing at the small observation window and speaking in through the comm system. "Do you have any explanation for being out for 2 days? You were supposed to be back within 12 hours of departure," one of the men said. General Pratt, an older man in charge of the US interests up here on base. We've been very concerned. A rescue mission was being organized when you three drove back up. House, leader of the Chinese delegation on the base, was looking at us with much less rage than Pratt was. Look, we were gone for maybe 4 or 5 hours. We got to the designated point, found a cave, went down, stayed for a minute, came back up. Now we're here. It's only been a short few hours. Sandra was trying to explain, but none of us were seeing eye to eye. Everything was off, and the concerned expressions on these two men's faces were making us all uncomfortable. What about the suit footage? We have GoPros set up in those things, so just check them, you'll see. Sho was almost frantic, the prospect of that missing time almost breaking his brain. We had discussed it on the way in, with none of us able to account for it, all agreeing we were only gone for a few hours. The more we thought about it, the more it made sense, though. The dust on the RV couldn't have gotten there in just those few hours, and there weren't any storms recorded in the area at the time we were gone, so where the hell did the time go? We're actually checking suit cameras right now. We don't know what in the world you found down there, but right now we're 7 hours in, and the footage as soon as you get ready to leave down there just becomes still. You have your samples, you're packed up, talking about your discovery, then before you can turn around to leave, everything gets weird. All three of you stop, standing like statues the entire time. We've got a couple of guys skimming the footage, but so far there's no change. The batteries on the cameras likely died during the time you were out, but that's not the biggest problem here. Pratt explained. That makes no damn sense. We would have run out of our air reserves. I mentioned, we only have 24 hours in those things, but there was enough for us to make it back. You took your damned helmets off. You didn't use any of your air reserves. Howe leveled, looking each of us in the eyes in turn. So how the hell are you here right now? We what? I stammered out. No, that makes no sense. We had our helmets on the entire time. None of us was stupid enough to take them off up here. That would be instant death. So what the hell? Look, there's no way any of us would have done that. We're not stupid. Wouldn't be up here if you were, Pratt said, looking into my eyes now, seriousness in his furrowed brow. But I need to know what the hell would make y'all do that. We don't know, sir, Sho whispered. Sandra was staring blankly in front of her, and he had his hands crossed in front of him in prayer. There was no telling what was going through their minds, but I know mine was racing with thoughts of the past few hours. I didn't feel any different. There was nothing off about my body. Once we got out of the Atmos suits when we entered, it was refreshing to breathe clean air again, but nothing indicated they were off before then. Look, we're going to keep you three in observation for a bit, just to make sure everything is baseline, Howe said, putting his hands up to calm us, despite everyone's dumbfounded, quiet state. We'll let you have Lab 2, though, that way you can study your findings in the meantime. Sir, are we going to go back to Earth again? Sho asked, fear in his eyes now. He was thinking the same thing we were. Having no helmets on, especially down there, all kinds of possible pathogens or biological hazards could have gotten to us. There was no telling what we may have brought back to the base. God, what have we done? I don't know, Howe said, a heavy weight in his voice. I do know that your discovery will lead to immense advancements for humanity, though, and you will be a part of history no matter what. That's not promising, I muttered, looking at the lab around me. Where are my samples? They'll be brought in momentarily. We're cataloguing items right now to be sure, Pratt said, nodding over to a small exchange door on the lab wall. Once it's ready, they'll put it through there. Throw some whiskey in there too, if you can. If I'm trapped here, at least let me drink. I mentioned, hoping for the best. Pratt just nodded, so I'm taking it as a good sign. The two officers walked away then, leaving us to ponder our own mortality for the foreseeable future. I tried to sit in one of the chairs in the corner, but something was making me stay up, only letting me pace nervously as we awaited the samples for study. Sandra was only staring ahead at the wall, while Sho was muttering to himself constantly, going over ways in his head to find out what may be wrong with us, or if there was some way to test. We were in a lab, so not like there weren't resources around, but with the addled state our brains are in, there's no thinking straight like that. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. Finally, a bin was pushed through the exchange drawer, our sample vials inside along with a few other items from the RV. Underneath, a bottle of Jack nestled in for all of us to split. I practically dove for it, desperate to see what we had found, what was keeping us in here, and for a drink. Look, I'm well aware at this point I probably have a problem. Least of my worries now, though. taking a swig straight from the bottle, then offering it to the others, who both shook their heads. I was ready to face whatever we were up against. One of the samples went into a test to see exactly what the hell it was, and I took a small drop, putting it right on a slide and barely getting it in place before pressing my eye to the scope. No fucking way, I said, focusing in on the scope dials to get a more clear look at what was below. Small, red cells formed and slipped around each other in the fluid. Sandra, Sho, I need you to look at this. What is it? Sho asked, coming forward. Sandra didn't respond for a moment, having to shake herself out of a stupor as I tapped her on the shoulder. Look and tell me what you think, I said, making room in front of the microscope for him. He put his eyes to the viewer, adjusting for a moment before gasping, stepping back and almost stumbling into one of the counters. Sandra stepped up to look and had the same response, falling to the ground and scrambling backward. Is that blood? Sho was holding his stomach, a dry heaving starting to work its way up to escape his mouth. Can't blame him, considering that was my first thought as well, when seeing the red cells pulsating and moving past each other. Why is it moving? I don't know. I really don't know. I have some testing to see if it really is blood. There's something else in there too, though. Did you see it? I asked, adjusting the slide toward another direction. Look again. Sho peered back into the scope, gasping as he saw the same thing I did only moments ago. A small, dark organism, moving its way through the red cells and eating them. I don't know if that's what it was actually doing, but just it touching the red cells made it begin to shrink, decaying to nothing before it moved on to another. Could that be in us? He asked, looking from me to Sandra. I noticed now his eyes were bloodshot, a dark red against pale skin. It creeps me out, but I'm chalking it up to lack of sleep. Hell, I probably look no better. The machine nearby dinged, telling me the first vial's component testing was done. Paper began feeding from the computer nearby, the results of the machine's work. I hesitated, swallowing the lump in my throat before grabbing the paper, ripping it off and closing my eyes as I brought it to my face. You have to look, have to. I opened my eyes, reading off the results before me with shock. The test designated it as blood, but it was so much worse. Oh my God. It took a few seconds to hit me, but I still managed to make it over to the trash can before puking my guts out into the garbage. The freshly downed alcohol burned its way back up like hellfire, making me wince and choke. Sho snatched away the paper before it could float to the ground, left behind while I was dealing with my own existential dread. I could see his face turn pale as the same results were read off. Human, he whispered, scanning the paper again and again to see if he was imagining it, desperately hoping that the results would change before his eyes. The hell does this mean, Teller? I couldn't even speak, just shaking my head as another heave of anxiety worked from my gut upward. It hit me then that we had another sample, the small glowing organic material that Sandra took. I grabbed the tube from within the box, emptying it onto a slide to inspect it now. The spore was small, still giving off a faint blue light even out of the natural environment, but no bigger than the smallest grain of sand. Another slide was quickly pressed atop it, moving right under the scope to reveal whatever horrors we may have been down there with. It wriggled under the pressure of the slide, trying desperately to escape. As I looked through, small pincers became visible on one end of it, with hundreds of small legs branching off in every direction, scurrying, stressed beyond its limits, trying to get out of the new environment. It's alive, I muttered, moving over so Sho could take a look. I don't know what the fuck it is, but it's a living biological organism. Oh my God, he whispered in return. Sandra sat in the corner, still out of it, but now grabbing at her skin, complaining of an itch. Sho was trying to cry through bloodshot eyes, looking at me as he moved his eyes from the microscope. We found life on Mars. Great. Fucking great, I muttered, taking another drink and feeling it burn down into my empty belly. My mind was racing, not sure of if I would ever make it off this godforsaken desert planet. Sho continued staring through the microscope now, studying the creature before a thought came to him. As he grabbed a dropper and the remaining blood samples, opening the slide, I almost stopped him. It occurred to me that we're about to do something bad, that we've discovered something that could inevitably kill us all. Yet I couldn't stop him because of my own curiosity and apathy surrounding my current situation. Look, Sho told me, gesturing me closer to the microscope now. The thing inside the slide was absorbing the entire sample of blood Sho had just set on the slide, growing as it did. The blue glow pulsed as it absorbed more of the life force nearby, greedily sucking it all up as it grew like a damned tick. "It won't stop," Sandra muttered, grabbing at her skin, pulling on it like she was trying to get something off of her. I noticed scratches beginning to show as her nails dug deeper into her arm. The itching. It won't go away. I'm so itchy it hurts. "What?" I asked, moving over to her. "What's itching?" "Everything." She shuddered again, a cold sweat shining on her forehead. I could see her growing pale, eyes bloodshot like Sho's. He was looking at me in fear, an understanding forming in his eyes as Sandra clawed at her skin more furiously. "Everything. Crawling." She screamed as her nails finally tore through her skin, unleashing a small trickle of blood that began down her arms. Moving. The blood was moving, pulsating down. As it dripped to the floor under her, it began to scatter before disappearing, the luminous blue color pulsating, reflecting off the crimson blood like some fucked up police lights. Oh shit," Sho said, grabbing the nearest sterile tray he could find and starting to beat at the micro-terrors skittering around the ground. It almost reminded me of that mummy movie, all the scarabs bursting from skin. I shivered, fighting to keep my composure. These things were more like roaches, surviving the hardest hits from the tray as Sho fell to his knees, desperately smashing the tray into the ground to no avail, as these things simply absorbed more blood, scrambling for every drop that fell from Sandra, bringing newcomers to the feast along with it. Sandra grew more pale, eventually beginning to shrivel from the blood loss, thousands of the things swarming around, feeding on her from the inside out. I was brought out of my stupor by Sho shouting once more, "Tell her! Help!" I don't know what I was thinking, but I grabbed the bottle of whiskey off the table, took a lighter we used for some old Bunsen burners nearby, and getting ready, I heaved the full bottle back, getting ready to smash it toward the tile floor with all my might. "Move!" He pulled away just in time, leaving the bloody tray rattling on the floor. The bottle hit the ground, exploding into glass and whiskey all over. I hit the lighter, getting ready to toss it right after, but before I could, something began to happen. Blue lights across the floor began to sputter out, the organisms stopping where they were and convulsing as the alcohol touched them. Everything that was touched by the spirits began to seize, staying where they were on the ground and thrashing in agony as they died. I could hear a small guttural scream echoing out in chorus as they died, hundreds going silent one after the other. The occasional one would still crawl from one of Sandra's wounds, falling to the ground into the drink before writhing in agony, like those before it, dying on the floor. "She's dead," Sho whispered, looking at Sandra's drained corpse. They killed her." "Sho, I need your blood," I said, already grabbing a scalpel and holding it up to one of my fingers. "God, please." I hesitated before making the incision, praying to whatever gods on Earth or Mars that I wouldn't have those things in me. "Please." The razor-sharp blade didn't even hurt with all the adrenaline running through my veins. I grabbed a fresh slide, squeezing a drop out onto it. I closed my eyes as the other slide was put on top, loading it under the microscope and praying one more small plea before looking down. "Oh, thank fuck." I breathed a sigh of relief, seeing no traces of the small creatures, just healthy swimming red and white cells, clean blood. "Sho, come on, we need to be sure." "Where?" I know. I'm ahead of you," he said, grabbing a new scalpel and slide to take his own sample. The incision was made, his eyes closing with prayer like mine did just moments ago. We knew before we could get it under a microscope, before we could even get the slide on top. This blood was pulsating. A blue glow from millions of tiny dots almost made it look like there was glitter scattered into the crimson, mixing into a deep purple. He became more pale. "I'm going to be sick." "Don't go on my yet," I said, grabbing a bottle of isopropyl alcohol from a nearby cabinet. One drop on the slide and I put a top on it, sliding it under the scope to watch and see if my theory had any kind of hope. It worked. The spindly, glowing creatures were thrashing around on the slide, blue glow sputtering as they seized up just like the ones from Sandra. The blood was left alone, preserved by the alcohol for now, as the creatures died off in huge numbers. My belief is fucking vindicated. There might be a way out of this after all. If I'm right, I might be able to save Shoto before he gets drained like Sandra. The phone in the corner of the room began to beep, a signal coming in from wherever they were keeping an eye on us at. Running over, I was out of breath before they could even get a word out, making my demands as fast as possible. "Strongest drinkable alcohol we have. I need it. Higher proof the better. Now!" I was almost yelling into the receiver. Swear I could hear the guy on the other line retreating from the damn phone. All he gave me was a yes sir before Pratt came on the line, voice gruff. "The hell happened in there?" he asked, anger in his voice. "Sandra's dead. Show might be too if you don't get me those drinks fast enough. You might want to have a few yourself just in case," I mentioned, pulling back for a moment and waiting for his answer, expecting him to offer some rebuttal to what was happening now. "Okay, do what you need to," he mumbled. Something was off. Something about how he was responding to the situation. He was too calm. "Sir, you assigned this research point, right?" I asked, gauging my words carefully. "That's not a question for right now," he shot back, hanging up the line. "That bastard knows something," I muttered, turning back to Shoto and seeing him begin to shake. Just in time, I heard the transfer drawer slam, 2 big glass bottles being shoved through in a bin, 1 whiskey like before, and 1 bottle of, holy shit, Everclear. No idea why anyone brought that up here when there were always better things, but who am I to judge? I uncapped it, shoving it to Sho. "Drink. Don't know how much, but just get drinking." "You sure about this?" he asked, grabbing the bottle and taking a huge gulp. His face contorted in disgust as the burn descended through his throat, down into his stomach. Assuming he was on an empty stomach, I know mine had been growling, so it was likely, the alcohol should absorb quickly into his blood, giving us a much more favorable time limit than Sandra had. "No, but what choice do you have?" I shrugged, uncapping my own bottle and taking a hard gulp. He shrugged, the very act looking like it was uncomfortable for him. I could tell he was starting to hurt, getting that same feeling Sandra must have had before the itching started. The microorganisms must not be big enough yet to cause that, but I'm sure they were feasting on the blood in his veins as we sat, now passing the bottle of whiskey back and forth, a much more palatable alternative to the Everclear. I kept an eye from him to the digital clock on the wall, every minute passing by in agony. These things died on almost immediate contact, so it was just a matter of letting the alcohol get into his bloodstream and spread through his body. After 20 minutes we both were feeling nervous, but the time came. "Take 2? Guess so," Sho replied, holding out his hand to me. The scalpel went through his finger, dropping onto the slide I was holding. It wasn't moving, no pulsating, just still blood. He sighed in relief, but to be sure we loaded it into the microscope. The microorganisms were still in there, but completely still, no glow coming from them anymore. It worked. Sho let out a sigh, holding up the bottle of Everclear and giving a toast. "Cheers to not being drained from the inside, I guess." "We have other problems now," I said, raising my bottle and drinking again alongside him. "God, I need food, though." I went to the phone, ringing out to security to request something be brought in. There was no answer. Only silence met me on the other line. "Sons of bitches," Sho said, moving to the window and beginning to bang a fist against it. "Hey, let us out!" "They're not going to," I mumbled, looking around at our options. There was that same feeling gnawing at me, knowing something obviously wasn't right. Pratt knew something about that area, but whatever it was, he wasn't telling us. I sat down in a nearby chair, leaning it back and looking at the ceiling, struggling to come up with an answer to what we could do. "We could break the window," Sho offered, a fist still balled up against the glass in front of him. He looked woozy, not holding his liquor very well. Couldn't blame him either. Drinking on an empty stomach isn't too pleasant. I was only moving around fine because I was so used to it, but he was having a struggle going on in his body. Can't imagine he was feeling great after the blood loss either. Barely bleeding yet being mostly drained must be one hell of a sensation. "I don't know, man. I don't know what the hell we should do about all this. Whatever that is too dangerous to just stay here. I don't think Pratt has good intentions for it either," I said, looking straight into the camera in the ceiling corner. "Do you, you bastard?" "How did that get there, though?" he said, whispering in a shaky voice. I could only shake my head and shrug. "Above my pay grade," I mumbled, finally getting up after a moment, grabbing one of the metal material carts nearby and pulling up on the handle to test its weight. "Should be all right. Think you can distract them for a while?" "I'm going with you," he said, trying to stand himself but stumbling instead. No, you're not. I need to move fast, I said, crouching to get a good grip on the cart, lifting with my entire back into it. You need to send a message back home about this. They don't need to send anyone up here. You serious? He asked, sitting back on the counter now, looking more faint. Adrenaline was probably wearing off for him, with no telling how much longer he would stay conscious. You saw how quickly that killed her, right? She's just your baseline. That stuff thrives on blood, and if it gets back home, what was all this for? Terraforming fucking Mars just to bring death back to a dying Earth? Useless. I began ranting, yelling as I stepped toward the observation window. No going back now. I heaved one more time, tossing the cart with all my strength. The glass shattered, scattering the floor outside in the hall. I draped a fire blanket over the edge, scraping broken glass off before I climbed over. Toss me the ISO over there, I shouted back to Sho, who began to grab the alcohol from the cabinet nearby. The hell are you going to do? He asked, tossing one bottle at a time over the broken windowsill to me. We didn't see how far that cavern went back. I'm going to see if I can find a source, I mentioned, pointing to a bag that was left over one of the lab chairs, which Sho promptly tossed over. Loading the bottles in, I started off, moving back towards the cafeteria. Stay safe. I'm going to take care of things. Be careful, he shouted after me. Unlock the door too. Flipping the lock as I passed by, Sho slipped out and started going the opposite way, though where I have no idea. It took about 10 minutes for me to make it into the cafe, blowing past the poor cook on duty, taking every bit of alcohol I could, piling it into the bag, then beelining for the garage. I quickly found out where Sho had been, finding him struggling for breath, leaning against the wall leading into the locker room nearby. Suits in the RV. I told them to open the door as soon as you're in to let you out of the garage. I raided the other labs for ISO too, so there's more in there. It's just kind of thrown in though. That's all the energy I had. He was barely able to get the words out through labored breaths. Rest. I'll try to come back. Thank you, I said, patting him on the back before running through the door, scrambling into the still dusty RV we made the original journey in. That thing went faster than I had ever taken it, blasting through Martian deserts with no regard to the rocky terrain underneath. It was a much faster journey than the first time, and as I approached the formation popping up in the distance, I started mentally preparing my list. I was going to attempt taking the buggy down the entire way, crossing the path between seas on it as far as I could go. There had to be something at the end, somewhere back there, some way to stop these things from ever making it out of here. I loaded everything into the buggy before even deploying it, hardly letting the RV come to a stop before opening the bay doors. The entire back seat was filled with enough alcohol to make a college frat house sick, so hopefully it would stand up to whatever this was. It didn't seem to take much to kill them, but my fingers are crossed regardless. The buggy was out in seconds, rumbling down the path into the cave. I didn't even care about my own safety at this point, just hitting the pedal to the floor and hoping for the best. When the blue light began to glow from beyond my headlights, I finally started tapping the brakes a little. The cavern opened before me, lumescent blue in the great dark moor above, making entire star systems. God, it would be beautiful if I didn't know what the hell it was. Vibrant blue fell from up high, dropping into the blood sea like snow over the ocean, pulsing brighter as it settled into the warm life force below. I pressed on, turning on the brights on the buggy and carefully making my way onto the jagged rock path in between. The blood that was overtaking it made waves as my wheels passed through, making the blue twinkle as it was tossed up in my wake. Responding to the stimulus, I heard a loud scream, echoing off the cave walls yet miles away. Something knew I was there. The brights of the buggy didn't cut through the darkness as well as I had hoped, but I pressed on still, always keeping an eye on the path ahead. Eventually I could see that the cavern was narrowing again. The seas on either side were beginning to reflect off smooth walls, maybe 2 or 3 kilos into the cave, judging by the meter on my dash. My path stayed consistent though, a split in the Red Sea bringing me ever closer to what lay beyond, high above. The same pulsing kept going though began to slope inward towards something in front. At some point it looked like a tunnel of stars in some amusement park ride, except with the metallic scent of blood punctuating every part of my surroundings. There, up ahead. The light continued to pulse but much brighter, like a concentration of whatever was causing it. My brights began to reflect off the smooth cave walls around me, the seas narrowing further as the path met the wall, leaving only small trenches on either side of me, leading back to the sea. It almost looked to be flowing this way, but I couldn't tell well enough with the light provided. until I hit the full force of the glow, finding the end of the cavern abruptly. Whatever it was, it almost looked human. At least at one time it did. Centuries or eons ago, I have no idea, but this thing looked like a bastardized giant, a face with eyes only, millions of them covering the top half of it. These eyes were the source of the blue pulse, ringing through the entire cavern like a beacon to the others. I could see massive versions of the damn things, these parasites, crawling to and from near the base of the giant, exactly where the rivers of blood stemmed from. They were tearing at it, sucking greedily from the rivers as they tore at the thing, trying to empty more blood into their pit outside. The thing's mouth was open in a twisted scream, creatures crawling in and out with seemingly no purpose but to reproduce inside and out. Once they had drank their fill of the sustenance flowing from the giant, they climbed back to the cavern ceiling. These were the glowing stars that were hanging above us the whole time, dropping their growing offspring down into the seas to grow strong. One caught sight of me in the bright lights of the buggy, letting out a guttural shriek and running toward me. Hundreds of skittering legs holding up a slender body, blue light glowing brighter as it sensed fresh prey. I grabbed one of the bottles of ISO nearby, undoing the cap and splashing it when the thing came near. It fell back, screaming loud and alerting the others nearby as steam sizzled off its skin, hundreds of huge eyes glaring at me with hatred and hunger. My presence was known now, with nothing left to lose. I started uncapping bottles, emptying them into the rivers flowing from the giant, bright blue specks floating like little islands on the surface. The plastic bottles of ISO were all emptied when the screaming from others started, blue pulsating against the flowing red underfoot and pale flesh of the dead god in front of me. The things began moving forward, lights all combining into one dazzling show as they scurried toward me, fear shining in their eyes for what I was doing. I kept one of the ISO bottles to cover my way out, but not before pulling the lighter I had loaded into the suit pocket, flicking it right into the very flammable alcohol that was now floating around on top of the blood in front of me. They screamed louder as the flames roared high, giving me my first real look at them in full light. These things were extra ugly, the bright light serving only to bring prey into them. Underneath, millions of dark eyes were staring me down, hatred filling them as I burned their potential young before their eyes. I didn't care. I saw what they could do. This wasn't natural. This wasn't good. This was just pure evil, made to devour and reproduce. The flames grew high in front of me as I threw one of the drink bottles further, letting the flames mix and spread. There was enough room for me to three-point turn the buggy while they were still struggling against the flames, and I stepped on the pedal once more, opening bottle caps as I went back the way I came. Each bottle was emptied into the seas alongside me as I drove, a couple of drink taken by me in the process, just to fight off whatever nerves were still cutting through my adrenaline. As bottles were emptied on the way back, I could hear loud splashes far off in the distance, huge stars dropping from above to leave massive impacts in the sea, buffeting the buggy and threatening to throw me over the side every which way. I was struggling just to stay on the path, even more when I could see the larger blue glows skittering toward me, the surface tension of the seas, letting them walk like it was nothing. I don't know how I got out, but I just kept emptying bottles until they were all gone. When I finally hit the entrance, hitting the incline to go back up, I stopped to throw one last bottle of rum at the wall, seeing it smash as it hit the smooth, carved etchings in the wall. Striking a flare, I sent it sailing toward the broken glass, igniting the alcohol. To my surprise, the fire began to spread through the carving, ascending the wall with fervor and lighting up the entire surface with no discernible pattern in the flames, eventually overtaking the cavern ceiling above. Screams echoed from every direction in the cave as the creatures hit a fervor, the path of flames I had left floating on now frothing seas of blood behind me. There was no way in hell I was sticking around to see what the flames did. Screams chasing me all the way up as I almost put the pedal through the damned floor. I made it out into the harsh Martian sun, almost blinded from the total darkness down below. I don't know if Sho was able to get the message out. Hell, I don't even know if the alcohol is going to be an actual answer to the issue, or just a band-aid to keep them at bay. I'm typing everything up now in the RV, though, trying to send a message out back home to tell people. I know there was nothing I could do if they got out, and I know it would be the end if they got back to Earth. There's probably going to be some kind of inquisition when I get back to base, probably going to get arrested. Hell, considering how shady Pratt was acting, I don't doubt they were after this thing to utilize as a weapon or something. What's to come is a mystery, But for now, I'm going to just keep moving forward. There's no telling if I'll ever make it back to Earth alive, but I'll do my best to keep it safe from here, from these damn things. God, I need a drink. The land had been a steal, 50 acres nestled in the quiet of West Virginia Appalachia for what felt like pocket change. I'd spent years dreaming of a place like this, somewhere I could finally start my apiary and embrace a life far from the noise of the city. And now, I had it. Rolling hills, thick woods, a quiet valley with only the hum of bees to keep me company. When I first spotted the listing online, I figured it had to be a mistake. It was a 50-acre parcel, yet the price kept dropping with each year the listing stayed up. When I finally decided to reach out, I was surprised to hear back from a gruff-voiced realtor who sounded both eager and hesitant to get rid of it. He met me at the edge of the property on a misty, cool morning, his eyes darting around like we were being watched. As we walked the property, I asked the question that had been bugging me since I first saw the listing. Why hasn't anyone taken it yet? Most people around here think it's cursed, he replied, not meeting my eyes. Coal mine on the far end of the property collapsed some 60 years back. Owner who inherited it lost his family to it, moved off the land after that and never wanted to come back. He shifted his weight, kicking at the dirt. He just needs the money now, but most folks won't touch it. He looked back at me, and I could tell he thought I'd run from the sale right then and there, but I wasn't one for superstition. For me, it was just cheap land with a history I wasn't part of, so I signed. The house was solid enough for something built in the 40s, though it carried the wear and tear of every Appalachian winter it had endured since. The front door had a stubborn gap, the walls wore rough patches where sealant had tried to cover long-standing cracks, and the appliances seemed as mismatched as they could be, thrown together as an update by the previous owner. Still, it felt like home. After settling in, I spent my savings on a few dozen hive boxes and queens. I'd sourced bees from apiaries all over the state, setting them up across my property in carefully spaced groups, just far enough from the old mine. The countryside was idyllic, and I fell in love with the untamed beauty of the mountains. Each person I met, though, seemed to carry that same look of unease when they found out where I lived. The warnings all sounded the same. Don't go into the woods after dark, or keep your doors locked at night. When I asked if it was because of bears, they'd glance away and mutter about fey spirits, or even the Mothman. I'd smile, nod, and let them tell their tales, chalking it up to local superstition. The first year went by smoothly. My bees thrived, drawn to the untouched wildflowers and the perfect isolation. When the time came to harvest the honey, I set out to the hive site early in the morning, prepared for the sticky, sweet work ahead. As I checked each box, though, I noticed something strange. About a third of my hives were empty, yet they seemed full of capped honey. Or so I thought. I cracked open one of the frames, expecting the usual golden bounty, but a foul odor met my nose, a sickly, rancid smell that made me gag. The honey within was a dark, reddish-brown, thick and congealed like something dead. As I inspected the abandoned hives, I kept running through the possibilities in my mind. No signs of parasites, no signs of moths or mites, and certainly no sign of the queen absconding. Earlier that spring, I'd done a few splits for the stronger hives. Though being a new setup, I hadn't needed to do many. All signs had pointed to healthy colonies, yet here I was, staring into boxes that should have been full of life, met only with the sticky weight of something foul. I pried open another frame. Usually the hum of the bees around me was like a kind of white noise, a calming background that made the solitude out here bearable. This time, though, there was nothing. Just silence, broken only by the scrape of my hive tool as I opened the frame. I held my breath, not knowing exactly what I was expecting, but as soon as the frame came free, a wave of stench hit me, like the pungent reek of something dead, rotting in the summer heat. I gagged, stumbling back, fighting the urge to empty my stomach right there in the field. I forced myself to examine the honey. It wasn't the golden nectar I'd been expecting. Instead, it was thick, dark, and tinged a sickly reddish-brown. The sight alone was wrong, but the smell, like decaying roadkill mixed with something chemical and burnt, was almost unbearable. I took a marker from my pocket, labeling the infected hives in quick, shaky strokes, then turned to my healthy hives, hoping for something better. But even the healthy hives weren't right. I'd chosen Italian honeybees, known for their calm demeanor, yet today they buzzed in a low, angry hum, a noise that buzzed through my nerves. The bees seemed almost disturbed. Each frame I pulled had bees frantically crawling over one another, and as I moved to collect honey, several stung me, more in one morning than I'd experienced in all my time keeping them. I chalked it up to bad luck, but couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. I left extra honey in each hive, sure that they would need every drop of it in the cold months to come. With what I'd managed to salvage, I made the first of several trips to a small barn on the edge of the property I'd converted into my extraction room. The barn was a little sanctuary, just far enough from the hives that I could work undisturbed. As I processed the honey over the next few days, though, a troubling pattern emerged. Every time I went back to the hives, fewer and fewer bees buzzed around. My extractor spun the healthy honey just fine, and the thick liquid poured out in smooth ribbons, golden and sweet, exactly as it should have been. It tasted like honey should, clinging to my fingers and dripping in slow streams like molasses. Yet each time I saw the dwindling numbers of bees, that sickening image of the reddish-brown honey lingered in my mind, an unspoken warning in the silence of my emptying hives. Days passed, and I kept asking myself the same question, a nagging worry that wouldn't let go. Where were all my bees going? On my last day of extraction, I lost track of time, the sun slipping below the horizon as I finished bottling the final jar. Darkness had settled over the property, and as I locked up the barn, a thick chill settled in my gut. Out here, night came fast, drowning the hills in deep shadows and swallowing any trace of light. I wasn't afraid of bogeymen or the local legends whispered by folks in town, but bears were another story. Still, the walk back to the house was short enough, so I tucked my head down and started off at a steady pace. As I moved, though, the feeling crept up, the same uneasy sensation I remembered from childhood, when I'd turn off the basement light and dash up the stairs, convinced something was waiting in the dark behind me. I quickened my pace, the crunch of my boots filling the silence, but I could feel a prickle across the back of my neck, that ancient instinct whispering that I wasn't alone. Ahead, the house sat like a shadow against the dimming sky, but just as I reached the edge of the yard, a faint sound stopped me cold. A hum, rising from somewhere in the distance. I froze, listening. It was the sound of bees, unmistakable and growing louder with each second. Slowly, I turned to face the woods. My eyes were still adjusting, but as I stared into the trees, a shape began to emerge. Something large, hulking and black loomed in the shadows, shifting in sporadic jerks that reminded me of a bear, but something was wrong. Its movements were jerky and uneven, not like any animal I'd ever seen. A strange buzz filled the air, not the smooth, calming hum I was used to, but a chaotic mix of pitches that clawed at my nerves. I unslung the rifle from my shoulder, raising it to my chest as the figure moved closer. I squinted into the dark, my finger hovering over the trigger as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Its shape was bear-like, but the sound coming from it was alive, as if the creature itself was buzzing. My stomach twisted, a sick dread creeping up as the figure stopped, just within the edge of the forest. The creature's eyes caught the faint light from my porch, reflecting back a sickly, unnatural glint. I couldn't tear my gaze from it, feeling a pulse of raw, electric fear surge through me. Without thinking, I squeezed the trigger, the rifle's sharp report ringing through the mountain air, loud and raw against the night. The creature didn't roar or stumble as a bear might. Instead, it took off in a burst of movement, crashing through the underbrush with a speed and agility that made my skin crawl. The buzzing sound waned as it retreated, the forest swallowing its furious hum as it disappeared back into the blackness, leaving an eerie, consuming silence behind. I stood there, breath clouding in the night air, staring into the trees long after it had gone, waiting for that horrid sound to return. But there was nothing, just the hollow quiet of the woods, an unnatural silence that somehow felt wrong. The only thing that moved was my hammering pulse. Slowly I lowered the rifle, my heart pounding against the heavy weight of the weapon, and backed away toward the house, unwilling to turn my back on the forest. I barely slept that night, replaying the low, chaotic buzz in my head every time I closed my eyes. Even buried under the covers, I could almost feel the presence of that creature, still out there, waiting in the dark. By dawn, I was out of bed, bleary-eyed and unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was out there hadn't gone far. After I'd gathered enough courage and daylight was on my side, I took my rifle and headed back toward the spot in the woods where I'd fired at it. The morning was crisp, and the forest was draped in silence, each step of mine seeming to echo louder than it should. Near the place where I remembered seeing the creature, I spotted the rifle casing glinting in the dirt. I pushed further into the underbrush and soon came across something else. A thick, dark smear on the leaves and branches, black and slick, like tar but thinner, almost runny. I crouched closer, breathing through my mouth to avoid the stench that hit me. It was the same rancid, sickly sweet smell I'd found in the infected hives, but amplified, like the decay was infused with something darker, something wrong. The dark residue clung to the leaves, and as I examined it, I couldn't help but think back to the foul-smelling honey from the day before. Curiosity flared up, overtaking my dread, and I turned back toward my hives, determination replacing my fear. I'd put off investigating the infected honey, wanting to avoid that stench, but now I needed to know what exactly was going on with my bees. When I arrived at the hives, the sight made my stomach drop. The entire area was silent, every single hive empty. The reassuring hum I had grown to love was gone, replaced by an eerie, lifeless quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. Almost 40 hives and not a single bee remained. I could feel a pressure building in my chest as I pulled out frame after frame, each one thick with that rotten, red-brown honey. The day before, the hives had been mostly fine despite the infected few, but now there wasn't a living bee to be found. I hauled several frames of the rancid honey back to the barn, set on seeing this through. I lit the burner and heated my uncapping knife, working as I'd done 100 times, though this time each movement felt heavy, uncertain. The wax caps melted under the blade, but instead of the sweet floral scent that usually filled the air, a stench like rotting flesh wafted up, thick and almost tangible. I gagged, nearly doubling over, but forced myself to continue. Beneath the wax, the honey oozed out, a thick, dark red, bordering on black. It clung to the knife like coagulated blood, the smell intensifying with each cut I made. My eyes watered, and a wave of nausea hit me as I uncapped a dozen frames, struggling to keep down the bile rising in my throat. It was honey in form, but everything about it was wrong. Too thick, too dark, and that god-awful smell. Gritting my teeth, I loaded the frames into the extractor, desperate to get whatever this was out of the comb. As I spun the frames, the honey oozed out in slow, syrupy streams, pooling in the extractor's basin. The foul liquid clung to the metal, moving almost reluctantly, like it didn't want to be disturbed. The smell hung in the air, a rancid mix of decay and burnt sugar that seemed to settle in the back of my throat. I decided I needed answers. I had no idea what I'd find, but I wanted to send a sample of the tainted honey to a lab, anywhere that might be able to tell me if there was something in the environment, or worse, something lurking in the old coal mine that was affecting my bees. I uncapped the extractor's spout and watched as the honey poured into the bucket in a thick, viscous stream, oozing like clotted blood. It had the consistency of syrup left to sit in the cold too long, congealing and reluctant to flow. The sight of it, dark and pulsing in the dim barn light, made my skin crawl, and I had to resist the impulse to dump it out and walk away. I capped the bucket and set it on the workbench, knowing that for now I'd have to let it sit there, waiting like an accusation. Something was wrong with my bees, and even though I couldn't shake the memory of that creature in the woods, part of me hoped I was dealing with something simpler, some natural contaminant, some environmental hazard. That night, I bottled what I could of the good honey, my mind cycling through images of the creature, the rancid honey, and the black ichor smeared across the leaves. Each sound in the quiet house set me on edge, and when I finally turned in for the night, sleep was fleeting, broken by restless dreams of a buzzing swarm and those evil eyes staring back at me from the forest. Sometime deep into the night, a loud crash jolted me awake. My heart hammered as I lay there listening, hoping it was just some stray branch or the wind. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of bees, the furious buzz of a swarm coming from the direction of the barn. Cursing myself for not bringing my beekeeping suit inside, I threw on my clothes, grabbed my rifle and flashlight, and slipped out the back door. The cold air hit me like a slap, heightening every nerve as I crept across the yard toward the barn. The buzz grew louder as I got closer, an angry, pulsating noise that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on the barn doors. They were wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. I kept those doors locked with a chain, secured every night to keep out any curious animals, but now the chain hung loose, as if something had wrenched it free with ease. I tightened my grip on the rifle, every instinct in me screaming to turn back, but I forced myself forward, stepping over the chain and shining the light into the barn. The swarm was everywhere, bees darting and swirling in a chaotic frenzy, so thick they looked like a storm cloud of black and gold, filling every corner of the barn, and in the center of it all, standing amid the furious swarm, was the bucket of dark honey. The lid lay twisted off beside it, the sickly liquid spilling over the rim, dripping onto the barn floor in thick, sluggish drops. The swarm whirled in violent chaos around the bucket, thickening the air with the furious hum of countless bees. They buzzed erratically, their sound jagged and unnatural, as if something monstrous was twisting their very essence. My flashlight trembled in my hand, illuminating the spilling honey, dark and viscous, dripping over the rim like a slow bleed. Then, from the far shadows of the barn, a shape began to emerge. The beam of my flashlight caught the edge of something massive and hunched, dark fur slick with patches of what looked like congealed blood. The creature moved slowly, dragging itself out of the shadows, each step accompanied by a rattling wet breath. Its eyes, red and gleaming, fixed on me with an intelligence that seemed ancient and hungry, far too knowing for any animal. It straightened slightly, towering above, and that's when I saw it. The thing had a mouth, but not like any mouth I'd ever seen. From its chin down to its navel was a gaping, grotesque maw lined with rows of twisted, jagged teeth, each one yellowed and uneven. The flesh around the maw was stretched and torn, as if it had split open under its own sickening hunger. Inside, the mouth was a pit of darkness, wet and glistening, and I could see flashes of those serrated teeth glinting as it moved. The creature's gaze was locked on me as it took a step forward, the maw twisting into what could only be described as a smile, the lips, or what passed for lips, curling back to reveal even more teeth. A slathering hiss escaped from the monstrous chasm, a sound that raised every hair on my body. Suddenly the swarm surged toward me, as if following some unspoken command from the creature. The bees struck like a storm, their stings piercing through my clothes, jabbing into my skin with merciless fury. I stumbled back, trying to shield myself, but the pain was everywhere, hot and sharp, each sting pulsing with venom. The buzzing was deafening, filling my ears, clawing into my mind. In a frenzy, I raised the rifle, barely able to keep my aim steady as the swarm attacked, stingers burrowing into my face, my neck, every inch they could reach. I fired blindly, the shot echoing through the barn. The creature lurched, its maw splitting wider, and it let out a horrid, gurgling roar that sounded like it came from the pit of some endless, hellish cavern. I fired again, this time catching it in the shoulder. Black ichor sprayed from the wound, thick and foul-smelling, mingling with the stench of rotting honey. The creature staggered, momentarily retreating, and I seized my chance, turning and running for the open barn doors, tearing through the swarm as they tried to follow me. Behind me, that horrible guttural roar rose up once more, and the swarm broke off, as if summoned back to their master. I glanced back just long enough to see those red eyes fixed on me from the darkness, the gaping maw closing, only to open again in a silent, taunting promise. I stumbled out of the barn and into the night, bruised and burning from the stings, heart pounding with the terror that it would come after me, that it would come for whatever was left. The creature dropped to all fours, its massive twisted limbs propelling it forward in a horrifying sprint. I barely had time to react, my body operating on pure instinct as I fired 2 more rounds, the shots ringing out sharp and loud in the night air. But it didn't stop. It barreled toward me, faster than any animal I'd ever seen, jaws gaping in that nightmare maw. I turned and ran, adrenaline surging as I tore across the yard toward the house. The barn was far behind me now, but the stings from the bees still burned, searing into my skin with each step. I gritted my teeth against the pain, trying to reload as I stumbled, forcing myself to focus despite the agony that laced through every inch of my body. My hands were shaking as I finally got a round chambered, and without slowing down, I whipped around and fired. The shot struck home, and the creature halted, its twisted body jerking as a wretched howl escaped its open maw. The sound was somewhere between a scream and a death rattle, filling the air with an unnatural echo that made my skin crawl. Then, just as suddenly, The bees attacking me dropped to the ground, littering the yard in a sickening splatter, their bodies piling around my feet in a grotesque, sticky mess. I felt their tiny corpses hit my skin, felt their stingers break off inside me, but the intense buzzing had dulled, weakening as if the force driving them was finally retreating. I forced myself to look up, catching the glint of a single red eye shining out from the darkness. The creature stared back at me, wounded but still seething with that primal rage, until, with a shuddering breath, it turned and disappeared into the trees, the broken buzz of bees following it like a death march. The forest swallowed them both, leaving only the quiet and a low, fading hum. I stumbled the rest of the way to the house, my mind spinning and my body on fire. In the bathroom, I collapsed against the sink, barely able to recognize the reflection that looked back at me. My face, neck, and hands were swollen with stings, red welts forming where the bees had latched on, and my clothes were covered in dead bees, their sticky black ichor staining the fabric. Broken off stingers jutted from my skin, each one leaving a small, painful pulse of venom. Shaking, I began pulling out the stingers, one by one, feeling the sting each time. The ichor clung to me in thick patches, its rancid, sickly sweet smell filling the bathroom. I scrubbed at it frantically, but it felt like it had seeped into my very skin, lingering in my hair, my clothes, everywhere. When I finally looked up, the creature's blood-red eye was still burning in my mind, a smouldering ember that wouldn't let go. I didn't know what I had just encountered out there in the barn, but whatever it wasn't finished with me. And as I stood there, stripped raw and aching, I knew that this place, with its cursed land and rotting honey, was no longer mine. It belonged to that creature now, and I had been nothing more than an intruder. I spent the next hour meticulously washing off the foul-smelling ichor, scrubbing my skin until it was raw and red. The stingers came out one by one, each removal a fresh jolt of pain that spread through my whole body. There were barely any places the bees hadn't stung. My skin was swollen and pulsing with venom, every nerve alive with a deep, throbbing agony. When I finally lay down, exhausted and sore, I felt the phantom hum of those bees beneath my skin, echoing in my bones. Sleep, when it came, was restless and fractured. I drifted in and out, the pain a constant, gnawing reminder of the nightmare I'd just lived. By morning, though, the swelling had receded, far faster than I'd expected. My skin felt tender, but the worst of it was gone, and the venom's fiery pulse had dulled to an uncomfortable ache. As the morning light crept across the yard, I knew I had to go back to the barn and face whatever was left of the night's horror. I steeled myself and opened the barn door, the sight inside freezing me in my tracks. The floor was carpeted with the remains of my bees, thousands of tiny bodies lying in thick piles, each one dusted with that black, tarry substance. Pools of the blood-red honey had oozed across the dirt floor, glistening in the dull light, the stench of decay and sweetness so overpowering that it turned my stomach. But something about the honey was different. It still smelled like rot, that sickly sweetness hanging thick in the air. But now it almost seemed to beckon, as if something buried in that cloying scent was calling out to me. I don't know what possessed me, but before I knew it, my hand reached out, dipping a finger into the honey. I lifted it to my mouth, feeling its strange warmth as it slipped over my tongue, a deep, intoxicating taste that was both horrible and irresistible. After that, things are hazy. I can remember brief flashes, a blinding rush of heat through my veins, my skin prickling as if thousands of tiny legs were crawling under it. Then darkness and a deep, gnawing hunger that seemed to consume me from the inside out. When I finally came to, I was lying on the cold tile of my bathroom floor, naked and aching. The rancid, sweet taste of the honey lingered in my mouth, clinging to my lips, thick and sour. My muscles ached as I forced myself up, reaching for the bathroom light, and as I looked into the mirror, my hand froze mid-air. Running down my chest, from my collarbone to my navel, was a line of teeth, sharp and jagged, interlocked like a zipper, pressing up against my skin from within. Each one was small but sharp, stretching the skin as if something inside me was trying to break free. My hands trembled as I reached up, touching the edges, feeling the points where skin met teeth, and a deep, hungry craving bloomed in my chest. I wanted more. The honey. The foul, bloody honey that had taken my bees, that had summoned that thing from the woods. I could still taste it, sweet and rotting on my tongue, and I needed it, desperately, completely. The creature in the barn, the monster with the endless maw, had left something inside me, and as I stared at myself, the zipper of teeth grinning back at me in the dim bathroom light, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever hunger it had passed on, whatever part of itself now lay under my skin, it was awake, and it wasn't done. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.